Hi everyone, I'm Sky Waston, and in this video we are going to learn about web APIs and how we can interact with them in Godot. So before we begin, let me quickly outline what are we going to do in this video. We will first understand what an API is, then use a freely available public API, after which I go through a paid one, and finally demonstrate a few concepts using a local server. So let's begin. First, let's understand what an API is in context of the web. API stands for Application Programming Interface. So let's understand this by an example. Suppose you have a game where you store high scores of the player and you want to get the leaderboard data where players are ranked based on their high scores. Here, the player is playing the game on their device. It can be anything like a PC, console, or a mobile phone. We call this device a client. So the player goes to the leaderboard menu and now the game wants to retrieve the list of players. To do so, it has to communicate with the server. We do so by specifying the URL in the request we are going to make. So our game's code will make an HTTP request to a URL. The server receives the request, processes it, and sends back a HTTP response. This response will contain the list of players ranked based on their high scores. Let's quickly get an idea of both HTTP request and response. So HTTP request is sent by the client, in our case the player's device, to request some form of data, while the HTTP response receives the request, processes it, and sends back a response. The content of both HTTP request and response are mostly similar. In this video, we will be focusing on JSON as it's widely used for sending and receiving data in text format. So in Godot, we are going to be making HTTP request using the HTTP request node. So let's set up a script and add reference to the HTTP request node. By the way, I'm using type hints, so the syntax of the code will be a little different if you haven't used types before. This is completely optional, but if you want, you can enable types to be added during autocomplete in the editor settings. Now let's connect a signal called request completed to a function. This function will be called when we receive a response from the server. So as a start, let's make an HTTP request to google.com. In the function, we convert the data we received in a readable format and then print it out. When we run the game, we see that we receive a bunch of gibberish. So if we have a closer look at it, this is actually HTML. Well, this information is useful for web browsers to display the web pages, but in our case, we want something through which we can get information in a much more readable format. So let's use a free API to get some interesting information. Here in this website, we can use their API to get data on some cool trivia quizzes. So with these settings, I'm going to generate a URL and go to it in a new tab. And we got the requested data in JSON format and it's displayed on the web page itself. So to better understand JSON, let me copy it and paste it in Notepad++. I select all the text by pressing Ctrl A and then press Ctrl Alt Shift M. So this will make the text much more readable. You will see the format of JSON is very similar or almost same as a dictionary in GDScript. So let's implement this in Godot. I will create a separate scene for handling HTTP request as it will make managing the project much easier. Here, I'm gonna write the same thing I did before. Now we will parse the data to get the JSON, and this will now work as a GD script dictionary. So now in main script, we will take reference to the Trivia API node and call its function makeRequest to get and print the data. Okay, so I did a bit of mistake. I actually have to parse the string and set the type of JSON to be dictionary. So let's run the scene. Let me copy the output and paste it in Notepad++ to view it in a readable format. So let's try to print the first question provided in the JSON. And we got the first question printed out. Before we proceed ahead, let's understand how the following HTTP request is working. In the URL, the highlighted part is the endpoint or the base URL, and the part with question mark and beyond is where the query strings start. Here we can pass down values to these parameters. For example, amount parameter is set to 10 here. If we have more than one parameter, we separate them out using ampersand or the and symbol. As an example, let's look at Google search. If I search for Godot, you will see the URL follows the same format. Now it does have some additional parameters that I'm not aware of, but if you just use the first parameter, we will still get the same result. Let's search GD script with query parameter. And here it is. So as an example, I created this basic quiz game which uses the Trivia API. So here I created an extra scene which deals with basically parsing the data. So this is optional, but I did it so I can restructure the data so it becomes easier for me to work with it when creating the UI. You can find the source code of this on my GitHub repository. Now before we proceed ahead with sending data in JSON format, let's go through a quick review on HTTP request and HTTP response. So starting with HTTP request, the request should contain the URL or the endpoint where we will be making the request. Then we specify the method. So this basically tells what the request wants to do. Does it want to retrieve data, add something new, or modify something, or maybe delete a resource in the backend? This by default in Godot's HTTP request node is set to get method. We will explore using other methods in just a moment. Then there should be headers included in the request. So these are basically metadata which tells the server about the contents of the request. Again, by default, we usually don't specify them explicitly in Godot unless we are sending JSON or other types of data. Finally, request body is where we send data, which is usually a bit more complex, as there's a lot of situation where query parameters won't do it, so that's where we use a request body. So in this video, we will be focusing on sending data in JSON format. Now let's quickly go through the contents of HTTP response. It is mostly the same. The one major difference is that HTTP response includes status code that will tell the status of the request after it's processed in the server. Some of them, like error 404, you would have seen quite often on web pages that can't be found. Finally, for the headers and response body, they are very much similar to HTTP request. Now let's see how we can send data in the JSON format. So for this demonstration, I will be using OpenAI's text generation API, which is basically ChatGPT 3.5. And it's not free, but the pricing is generous for personal use. So you don't really have to buy the credits, you can simply go through this section and get to know about using JSON in the request body. Also, let me clarify that this video is not sponsored by OpenAI. I am just using their API for showing you all how to send data in JSON format through HTTP requests, and also I think the example implementation we'll create with this API is gonna be pretty interesting. So if we go to their documentation, we find that they have given us the details on which URL to send the request to and what headers and data should be included in it. So let's first define and initialize the URL in Godot. Then we write the same boilerplate code. Now I will add a function parameter, that is question, and based on this we will get a response like we get when using ChatGPT. So here these are the headers, so let's define them in our script. Here each element of the array is a different header. So the header authorization bearer is used to identify the user of this API. For this I will have to create a secret key in OpenAI's website. So I will name it tutorial for now, and now copy this code. Now in our script I will directly paste it in the header, and make sure that you keep it safe. I am showing you this secret key in this video, but after finishing the recording I will remove the key from my account. So if someone is able to get access to this key and when they use this API, the charges will be added to your account, so it's important to make sure that the key is kept safe. Now usually we don't do it like this in production. In the GitHub repo I have shared, you will see that I have included a env file where the explanation will be given on how to use the key in the project. However, I'm not fully sure how it's properly done in Godot. So if any one of you know this, then do write this out in the comments. So now let's define the request body. We will first initialize it as a dictionary, and I will pretty much write down the contents of it the same way they are presented in the docs. Now we convert this dictionary into a string using stringify method of the JSON class. Finally, we pass down these values to the request method. So for the HTTP method, over here we will be using post. Also in their docs it's properly mentioned over here. Also you can find more details about the request and the response as well over here. So let's fill out the remaining arguments. Here when the response is received, I will do an additional check. So result is basically a Godot specific value, which when it's 0 it means everything went good, while the response code as explained earlier is one of the many status code we receive from the response. So over here 200 means that everything went alright. However, there are codes for other types of successful requests which are not 200. So this you have to verify from the documentation of whatever API you are using. So we will add the question argument here instead and pass the value when calling the function. Now let's run the scene, and here it is. So we can refer the structure of the response from the documentation and then access the value we want using the keys. And that's it. Now let's do something fun. By the way, this section of the video is optional, but I recommend you watch it as it's something pretty cool we can do with the ChatGPT API. So we can tell the API to give us a ChatGPT's response, which usually is in plain text, to something different. In our case, we will tell it to give us the message in JSON format. So why do this? Well, like I showed you earlier, how we were able to make a simple quiz game using Trivia API. So now we can ask ChatGPT to basically give us a quiz of 10 questions with multiple choices and a correct answer. All of this provided in a JSON format. This way we will able to easily extract the data and create a quiz game out of it. The main difference with the earlier approach will be that we will able to ask any type of question by simply typing it in simple English. So to begin, I will go to the JSON mode section of the documentation. Now I am going to update the request body as described in this example. We also need to make sure that in the question that we ask, or to be precise, the request body, we make sure that we explicitly ask for the response message to be in JSON format. So let's do just that. Here I will in simple English explain what I want from the response. For the format I want, I have created a basic template which I will provide to GPT. To make the message a little cleaner for the request body, I will escape this block of code into a single line. Here I am using ChatGPT to quickly give me the result. I will then paste it into the message. And that's it. Now for the question, let's say I type in solar system. So when doing it this way, it will take some time to get the response. And here we have it. Let's copy it over to Notepad++ and see this in an easier format. And this is it. Now here's how it will look like if we add it to the quiz game. Let's ask it to give us some question on game development. By the way, you can find link to this project in the description. Now I will use this tool Postman to quickly test out different APIs before we begin implementing them in code. So this will actually save us a lot of time. I will quickly give you a brief overview of it. So I will implement the same text generation API over here. So you can see that it already has the user interface to let us quickly test out APIs before we begin implementing them. And now if I press send, I get the response. Finally, let's look at an overview of how APIs are used in games where we have things like user authentication, leaderboards and similar things that involves having a backend server. So here I have a server made using Python where I'm using Fast API framework. Now you don't need to worry about knowing all of this code in Python. The reason I have made a local server is so that it becomes easier to demonstrate a few more aspects of an API. So here we have a bunch of functions, on top of which you will see a decorator that defines the endpoint and the HTTP method of that API. So if we look at the first one, it simply returns a dictionary with the message hello world. So I will run the server locally as I haven't deployed it anywhere, but if it was deployed, it would still behave the same. Now I will copy the address, paste it in Postman and send the request. We get the message hello world. Let me open it up in the browser too and you will see the same message. So I hope this gives you a basic idea on how an API is created and how it works in the backend. So here I have defined a bunch of APIs, for example /user, which gives us the list of all users in the database. And for the database, I am not using an actual database. Instead, for the purpose of this tutorial and to keep things simple, I am using a Python dictionary as a database. So that means anytime the server is restarted, all the data in the database will be lost. That's okay for us as this code base is for basic demonstration only. So let's go to the /user endpoint and see what we get. We get an empty JSON object. So now we are going to use the signup and the token endpoints to do the user authentication. Again, you don't need to worry about knowing what's going on in this code. However, if you want me to make a tutorial on creating server in Python, do let me know in the comments. Back in Godot, for doing user signup, we will first get the entered username and password. Here, same as before, I wrap it up in JSON and send it as a request. Whereas for the user login, the process is slightly different. Here I define the header that basically tells that the request body will contain the data in a form. So as you can see, when I am constructing the dictionary with username and password, I am not passing it to the JSON stringify method. Instead, I have made a separate method for converting this to a form as I wasn't able to find any already existing method for this in Godot. Finally, just as before, I pass in the values to the request method. So now let's run the game and see it in action. Before I sign up, let's first hit the user's endpoint and see the list of users. As you can see, it's empty. So after I sign up, and if we check the user's endpoint again, we see the new user we created is now saved. Now I have made two more endpoints. One is for saving user score and the other is giving us the list of players ranked based on their average high score. So if I go to the leaderboard, we see only one user in here and that too with a score of 0. So let's play a game of quiz, get some score and see the leaderboard again. And this looks much better. Now let me quickly create another user, play a quiz and check the leaderboard again. And that's it. So I hope this video gives you an introduction of using HTTP request node to interact with the web APIs. You can also find the written version of this tutorial on my website, link is in the description. So I hope this video helped you, and if you have any questions or feedback, do let me know in the comment section down below. So see you next time.